In the previous videos in this module, we've learned the basics about how psychologists conduct scientific research. Because psychological research often involves the study of people, it's also important to discuss the ethical considerations of working with human subjects, which is what we'll talk about more in this video. In psychology, there are established rules and guidelines by the American Psychological Association, the Association for Psychological Science, and other federal agencies that ensure the dignity, privacy, safety, and confidentiality of all those that participate in psychological studies. One important ethical requirement that all research with human participants must follow is informed consent. Informed consent is the process that occurs at the beginning of the study that provides potential participants with enough information to enable them to choose whether or not they want to be a part of the study. This is most often done through a signed document before any testing takes place. For example, participants must be told up front things like how long the study is expected to take, what they will be doing during the study, any potential risks involved in their participation, and any potential benefits that they might gain, such as if they're going to be paid a certain amount of money or if they're going to receive course credit, etc. Participants also at this point have the opportunity to have any of their questions answered. Even if a participant has signed the informed consent document, they still have the right to terminate their involvement in a study at any time and for any reason without penalty. If a participant is under the age of 18, which is the legal adult age in the USA, then they still must agree to participate in the study if they're old enough and capable to speak for themselves. But the informed consent must be signed by their legal guardian. If the participant cannot speak for themselves, then the legal guardian is fully responsible for their consent. Sometimes a psychological study might involve some level of deception. This means that the participant might not be fully aware of some aspects of the study. However, in these cases, participants still need to be fully informed about the study once it is complete. This is done through a process called debriefing, where at the end of the study, the researcher reveals the true purpose of the study and all of the measurements involved. Another major ethical principle that guides psychological research is to protect participants' well-being as much as possible. Although no study is completely without risk, psychologists can do things to reduce the risk to participants as much as they can. This might include things like keeping participant data confidential and protected, for example. Sometimes a study might involve a higher amount of risk, such as if a researcher needs to ask about highly sensitive information or if they want to work with a vulnerable population. In these cases, the researcher must balance the risk of the study with the potential rewards, such as the knowledge to be gained. For example, imagine that a medical research team wants to test out a new, potentially life-saving drug. Asking participants to take this drug has some risk because the potential side effects in humans might still be somewhat unknown. However, these potential risks may be worth it if the drug in question could ultimately help lots of people. And as we talked about previously, participants still need to be told up front about any potential risks involved in a study, and they have the right to freely decide if they're willing to accept those risks by participating. Who makes sure that psychologists are following all of these ethical principles? This is the job of institutional review boards, or IRBs. IRBs are made up of individuals at the institution, like at the college, such as Virginia Tech, and in the community. And they're charged with protecting the rights of human participants in research. An IRB helps determine the value and benefit of a proposed research study, as well as any risk that might be involved. Before a researcher can conduct a study, he or she must submit an IRB protocol with all the details of the proposed study. The IRB then needs to approve that protocol before the researcher can actually start collecting any data. And if any major changes need to be made to the research protocol later, those changes must also be approved by the IRB. Many of the psychological studies that we conduct involve pretty minimal risk to participants and therefore can go through what is called an expedited IRB review process. However, studies that involve a greater amount of risk may warrant a full meeting of the IRB board to decide whether or not the study should be approved. In addition to following basic ethical principles when working with human participants during data collection, researchers also need to be ethical when reporting their findings as well. This means that researchers, when they write up a manuscript for publication, they need to report honestly how they collected their data and what they found, even if their findings were not statistically significant. Unfortunately, historically, many academic journals have prioritized publishing statistically significant findings over non-significant ones. This can sometimes incentivize researchers to cherry pick their data, for example, only looking for the significant results. And in the past decade or so, there have even been a few high-profile cases of researchers committing outright academic fraud by making up fake data. Today, increasingly, there is greater awareness of and appreciation for the need for greater transparency in research reporting. Many researchers today advocate for something called open science, that is, making the science open, making materials and data available to other researchers for review. This practice disincentivizes cherry-picking data for only the significant findings, and it also makes it more difficult to get away with outright fraud as well. One organization, the Center for Open Science, provides an easy platform for researchers to do this. And many journals today will also award badges to researchers who decide to follow these principles and make their data, materials, or their analyses available to the broader scientific community. In this video, we talked about ethics in psychological research. For the exam, you should be able to define informed consent and debriefing and describe the purpose of each, define IRB and explain the process of how an IRB works,